We're joined again by former FBI General Counsel James Baker. Mr. Baker is able to talk to us tonight about some of these things, in part because the Mueller report has now been published, and so that sort of frees you to speak about matters you otherwise couldn't talk about. I have a question about the Mueller report and about what it doesn't say that I was expecting it to say. So I have a parallel here. One issue is Mike Flynn getting fired, which is something that unfolded while you were general counsel at the FBI. He speaks to the Russian ambassador. He publicly lies about it. Ultimately, he also lies to the FBI about it, right? And that's all interesting. That becomes part of a guilty plea in court. He lied to the FBI. But there was another thing we came to learn about his case. Sally Yates, as acting attorney general, goes up to the White House in the first week of the new administration to tell them not just that Mike Flynn has been in contact with the Russians, but that there's a problem because Flynn had that contact. The Russians know he had that contact because that's who he was talking to, and Flynn is lying about it publicly. And that means that the Russians have something on Flynn. They know about his contacts with them. They can leverage that against him. He's in a compromised position, therefore, with regard to the Russian government, which is very dangerous when he's national security advisor. That countered, so we learned the criminal part of what Flynn did, including lying to the FBI. But that counterintelligence concern is what leads us, the American people, to understand why it was so important that he had to go. I feel like we have a very similar situation with Trump Tower Moscow. The Mueller report describes all this factual detail about all of the contacts between the Kremlin and Kremlin-connected people and the Trump organization about trying to do that Russia deal. And we know that the president was lying about it at the time. Nothing in the Mueller report about whether or not that reflects any compromise, any effort to gain leverage over that presidential candidate, that campaign, ultimately our government. I feel like that's the missing piece. Was that investigation not done?
Well, I think the Mueller report makes clear that what they focused on were the criminal aspects of the counterintelligence investigation that was being conducted. So when the FBI investigates something, it comes to it with all of its authorities, which include counterintelligence authorities and criminal authorities and foreign intelligence collection authorities. All of the authorities under law and under Attorney General guidelines that the Bureau has, it brings to the problem. And certain aspects of a situation could be criminal and some might be counterintelligence. And so what I think is missing in large part from the report is an analysis of the counterintelligence aspects of what it is that they found. And I think it's either in the report or in some collateral documents where they make quite clear that, well, we're not talking about that here. We had embedded FBI agents with us to deal with the counterintelligence investigation, and that's some other file, some other thing that may or may not be in the report.
And in fact, in that part of Mueller's report where they describe having other FBI agents who were basically sitting in and gleaning anything that had intelligence consequences and passing it on to other parts of the FBI, they explicitly say those agents weren't part of Mueller's investigation. So does that mean that Mueller didn't do a counterintelligence investigation? I mean, on this question, for example, of Trump Tower Moscow, was there an FBI assessment as to whether or not that was an effort to gain leverage over that presidential campaign?
I don't think I can confirm or deny that particular thing, but the FBI is the entity that would be empowered to deal with the counterintelligence aspects of this. Mueller is like, and he says it right in the report, he was like a U.S. attorney, so he's a prosecutor. The FBI can investigate crimes, but it's also part of the intelligence community, and it has different authorities as a result of that under a different supervisory structure. So Mueller, I don't think, it's not fair to really think that he was tasked with conducting a purely counterintelligence investigation. He was tasked with, at least as I thought about it, dealing with the criminal aspects of the larger counterintelligence investigation.
Well, does
that make sense?
Does anybody ever have to tell, I mean, we, the American people, or perhaps more importantly, the intelligence committees in Congress, whether there was Russian leverage over the campaign? Whether those contacts and, for example, the Trump Tower Moscow deal amounted to perhaps a successful or even an unsuccessful effort to gain that leverage? I mean, the Intelligence Committee chairman, Adam Schiff, now says he hasn't had a briefing on the intelligence implications or findings of any investigation related to this stuff since Comey was fired.
So I can say how I used to handle it, and I used to handle it thinking that the intelligence committees were an integral part of how the United States conducts intelligence and how we maintain the intelligence community, maintain the trust and confidence of the American people, because they need to know that their representatives get access to critical information so that they can understand it. But look, one of the things is, the reality is that the intelligence community is under the command of the president. And so at the end of the day, it's the president's job to deal with the with the intelligence threats that we face as a country.
If they implicate him?
Well, so we haven't had to deal with this kind of thing before, so that's tricky. And how you do that is very difficult. So I think this is a place where, for example, the Director of National Intelligence could step in and try to handle some of these things in a certain way. I'm not going to describe it as a recusal by the president, but it would be safer and advisable for the president to sort of stay out of this part of it unless he really has to, and delegate some of that authority to the DNI.
It is so chilling to me to think that this is still a total black box to us. All right, I have more questions for you on this matter and others. James Baker is the former FBI General Counsel. We'll be right back with him after this.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.